Welcome to the Stories at Night channel, where we dive into the past so you can drift to sleep easily and gain wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. By the end of this tale, you'll be sound asleep. Close your eyes, the story is already beginning. Today we will speak of one of the most famous and significant literary masterpieces in human history, the ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey, traditionally attributed to the legendary poet Homer. Homer is an enigmatic figure who still sparks debate among historians and literary scholars. Ancient tradition places him in the 7th century BC as a blind, wandering bard who sang of heroes and gods. Modern researchers, however, suggest that Homer may not have been one person at all, but rather a name given to a whole tradition of oral storytelling handed down through generations. Whatever the truth, Homer's name is forever linked with two of the greatest works of classical antiquity: the Iliad, which recounts the final year of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is rightly considered one of the most important texts in world literature. In it, we follow the perilous journey home of King Odysseus of Ithaca after the Greeks' victory at Troy. The poem deeply explores themes of loyalty, courage, and cunning, the struggle of a man against fate and the capricious gods. It became a model for the epic genre and had an enormous influence on European culture, inspiring countless artists, writers, and philosophers for nearly 2,000 years. Our main mystery today is why Odysseus's return home took a full 10 years. What obstacles blocked his path? What heroic deeds did he perform, and what trials did he face? These are the questions we will answer, step by step, tracing the famous hero's path from the ruined walls of Troy back to the shores of his beloved Ithaca. To understand Odysseus's long journey home, we must first look at the very end of the Trojan War. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was one of the most resourceful heroes of Greek mythology. Unlike warriors famed for brute strength, such as Achilles or Hercules, Odysseus was celebrated for his exceptional intellect, cleverness, and knack for solving impossible problems. In the ancient world, he was seen as the very embodiment of wisdom and craft. His contemporaries respected and even feared his mental acuity almost as much as they did the fighting skills of other heroes. When the Trojan War broke out, Odysseus first tried to avoid leaving home. Legend says that after the beautiful Helen was abducted by the Trojan prince Paris, the Greeks gathered a massive fleet to sail against Troy. But the king of Ithaca feigned madness. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plow and sowed salt instead of seed, hoping the Greeks would call him insane and spare him. His ruse failed only because the clever Greek Palamedes placed Odysseus's young son, Telemachus, before the plow. Faced with harm to his child, Odysseus stopped, revealed his cunning, and agreed to join the war. For 10 long years, Odysseus fought under the walls of Troy, taking part in battles and showing brilliant leadership. He often counseled the Greek kings, untangling confusion in battle plans and helping his comrades avoid defeats. But his most famous feat was surely the idea of the Trojan horse, which finally ended the decade-long siege. Realizing that the Greeks could not take Troy by force, Odysseus devised a daring and audacious plan. He proposed that the Greeks pretend to give up the war and sail away. They burned their camp and withdrew their ships out of sight of the city, leaving behind a gigantic wooden horse as an offering to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war strategy. Odysseus himself hid inside the hollow horse, along with a band of the bravest Greek warriors. The Trojans, thinking the Greeks had deserted the siege and offered the horse in surrender, were astonished and jubilant. Despite warnings of Paistioi, the priest Laocoon had hurled a spear at the wooden horse, crying, "Beware Greeks bearing gifts," and the prophetess Cassandra had pleaded in vain for caution. The Trojans ignored these omens and dragged the horse into their city as a trophy of victory. In the dead of night, Odysseus and his men slipped out of the wooden beast and killed the city guards. They pried open Troy's gates from within and signaled to the returning Greek fleet. The hidden Greek army swarmed in and Troy was doomed. The city fell, its defenders were slaughtered or enslaved, and the victorious Greeks loaded their ships with vast riches and captives. Thus ended the bloody war that had lasted 10 years. After the victory, the heroes prepared to go home. Odysseus loaded 12 ships with treasure and faithful comrades, eager to see Ithaca again, to embrace his wife Penelope and the son, Telemaxus, who had grown up during his absence. He believed that ahead lay a calm and straightforward journey back to his homeland. But fate had other plans. Odysseus did not yet know that the gods had reserved for him terrifying trials, especially the wrath of Poseidon, who would soon unleash his fury and make Odysseus's homecoming take as long and agonizing a decade as the war itself. Odysseus's ships sailed from Troy's ruined shores into the open sea, heading west toward Ithaca. At first the weather was fair and the heroes, still proud of their victory, hoped to return home quickly and without incident. After a few days, however, they reached the land of the Cicones, or Cicones, a warlike people in Thrace known for their bravery and fierce martial skills. Their chief city was Ismaros, a rich, fortified trading center teeming with temples and armed guards. Odysseus decided to raid Ismaros for supplies. He led a sudden attack on the city to seize food and water. Initially, the Greeks had the advantage. The Cicones were caught off guard and could not mount serious resistance. Odysseus's warriors stormed through Ismaros, overwhelming the small garrison, and began plundering the city's wealth, gold, weapons, food, and wine. But this easy victory turned into disaster. Odysseus had warned his men not to linger, planning a swift raid followed by a quick retreat. Instead, his soldiers, intoxicated by greed and the joy of victory, refused to obey. They continued to sack and celebrate, drinking and feasting for hours. By the time they relaxed, the Cicones had regrouped. Survivors ran to neighboring villages and raised an army. Within hours, a large host of Cicones gathered outside Ismaros, heavily outnumbering Odysseus's men. Armed with bows, spears, and swords, the Cicones launched a surprise counterattack at dawn. In the first moments of the fight, the Greeks suffered grave losses. The battle raged for hours, chaotic and bloody. The once gloating sailors now fought desperately for their lives. Odysseus himself held the line, trying to organize a retreat to the ships, but his men were already falling back in disarray, abandoning their plunder in the streets. The Cicones pursued the fleeing Greeks to the shore. In the fierce struggle on the beach, Odysseus managed to order his remaining men onto their ships. But the cost was high. From each ship, 6 of his finest warriors had died, for a total loss of over 70 men. The Greeks, grief-stricken, finally sailed away under Odysseus's order, leaving the ruined city behind. This encounter taught Odysseus's crew a harsh lesson in discipline and the dangers of excess. As they looked back at the hostile coast, Odysseus gazed with sorrow toward the open sea, knowing his trials were only beginning. Reeling from their losses, Odysseus's ships left the land of the Cicones and sailed on. After 9 days at sea, fighting headwinds and storms, they came to a strange fog-shrouded island. Their water and food were nearly spent, and despair was setting in. Odysseus decided to send a handful of men ashore to seek fresh water and food and to see who lived on this mysterious land. The small party of scouts encountered the island's inhabitants, the Lotophagoi, or lotus eaters. These people were peaceful and friendly, living amidst lush groves and eating the fruit of the lotus plant. The scouts noticed that the lotus seemed to bring a dreamy, contented trance. Curious, some men ate the lotus fruit offered to them. Immediately, a strange apathy fell upon them. The sweetness of the lotus caused them to forget their cares, their homes, and even their hunger. They became passive and blissful, wanting only to stay and eat more lotus without returning to the ship. Odysseus soon learned of this danger. He went ashore and found some of his men in a state of blissful forgetfulness, lying under the lotus plants as if all worldly cares had vanished. Recognizing the peril, that these men would forget Ithaca and their mission if left there, Odysseus acted decisively. He rushed to the helpless crewmen, dragged them up to the ships, and bound them. They struggled and pleaded to stay and eat lotus forever, but Odysseus would have none of it. One by one, he forcibly hauled his enchanted companions back to the ships, tying them to the benches. Only when every addicted sailor was aboard did Odysseus finally give the order to cast off. Thus, Odysseus saved his men from the seductive but deadly lure of the lotus. The encounter with the lotus eaters became a cautionary tale. Even the sweetest comforts can be dangerous if they make you forget your purpose and your home. Odysseus's fleet continued along the coast of the mysterious island. After leaving the lotus eaters behind, his ships came upon a series of enormous stone caves on the shore. The men had run out of water and hoped the caves might shelter them and perhaps hold fresh water. Odysseus ordered a small party to investigate. He took 12 of his strongest warriors and entered one of the giant caves, where they found an astonishing sight. Large baskets of cheeses, pails of curds, and great wineskins, provisions clearly belonging to a creature of immense size. Suddenly the ground shook with a loud thud as the cave's owner returned. It was Polyphemus, a cyclops, a monstrous giant and son of the sea god Poseidon. He was huge and fierce, with shaggy hair and a single enormous eye in the center of his forehead. With his one great eye, Polyphemus blocked the cave's entrance by rolling a massive boulder into place, sealing it so securely that Odysseus's men could not push it aside. Polyphemus tended his giant flock of sheep inside the cave. When he saw Odysseus and his men, he bellowed, "Who are you, and why do you invade my home?" Odysseus greeted him according to the sacred laws of hospitality, calling himself Nomen. Nomen is my name. But the Cyclops was a brutal savage who despised the gods and their customs. With one ferocious motion, Polyphemus seized 2 of Odysseus's men and ate them raw, bones and all, before the horrified eyes of the others. 2 more men were devoured before the giant slept. Helpless to fight, the remaining Greeks watched in terror as the Cyclops ate their friends for dinner, then closed his one eye and fell into a drunken slumber. Clever Odysseus saw his chance. He had retrieved a large olive tree log from the cave and, while Polyphemus slept, worked it into a long, pointed stake. The others helped heat and sharpen it in the fire. When Polyphemus awoke and ate another 2 of Odysseus's men, Odysseus offered him a strong wine he had brought from Troy. Thirsty and never having tasted such potent wine, Polyphemus drank it all. After a few goblets, the giant grew dizzy and began to nod off drunk. Odysseus then approached Polyphemus with the burning stake, and with all his strength drove it straight into the Cyclops' one eye. Polyphemus screamed in agony, blinded, and thrashed wildly, clutching at his face. The other Cyclopes on the island heard Polyphemus's cries and rushed to the cave, shouting, "Who's harming you?" Polyphemus shouted back, no man is killing me." The other giants, thinking he was raving, left him alone in his agony. At dawn, still blinded, Polyphemus dragged away the stone and let out his sheep. Odysseus had prepared. Tied under the bellies of 3 of the largest rams, he and his men clung tightly as the blind Cyclops ran his hands over the backs of the sheep, missing them entirely. When Polyphemus opened the gate of the cave, thinking his captives were inside, Odysseus and his companions slipped out among the flocks. They hurried to their ship and set sail, but Odysseus's heart overflowed with pride. As his ship pulled away, he called back tauntingly to the blinded giant, revealing his true identity. "Cyclops, if anyone should ask who blinded you, say it was Odysseus, son of Laertes from Ithaca." Hearing his name, Polyphemus remembered an oracle that the son of Laertes would one day steal his eye. Enraged, the Cyclops cried out to his father Poseidon, swearing revenge. He begged the sea god to curse Odysseus so that he would never reach home. Poseidon heard his son's plea. Fulfilling the vow of a father, the god of the sea swore that Odysseus would not return to Ithaca easily or quickly. Instead, his voyages would be long, full of suffering and loss. 10 years of wandering, just as long as the Trojan War itself. Odysseus's ships pressed on, but now the sailors knew that Poseidon's hatred awaited them at every turn. After days of sailing, they came to an island unlike any other. Aeolia, home of Aeolus, the god who rules the winds. Aeolus lived in a splendid palace surrounded by high bronze walls on a floating island. He had 6 sons and 6 daughters, whom he married to each other to keep his line pure. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his weary crew with great hospitality. The heroes stayed in his halls for a month, sharing stories and resting from their trials. When Odysseus asked Aeolus for help to reach Ithaca, the wind god agreed. He gave Odysseus a great leather bag containing all the unruly winds that could hinder the voyage, east, north, south, and stormy west. Only the gentle west wind, Zephyrus, was left outside the bag. With this bag tightly tied and given in trust, Aeolus set the Greeks on their way, warning them not to open it until they saw their homeland. For 9 peaceful days, Zephyrus blew a soft breeze, bringing the ships swiftly toward Ithaca's shores. At last the crew saw the familiar coastline of their home in the distance. Believing the journey won, Odysseus let down his guard and fell asleep on deck, exhausted. But his men were plagued by doubt and greed. While Odysseus slept, they began to suspect that Aeolus's gift might hold treasure instead of just wind. In secret, they untied the silver cord of the bag. The moment they did, all the captured winds burst forth at once. A sudden, furious storm engulfed the fleet. Torrential winds and waves sprang up, hurling the ships far off course, driving them backwards away from Ithaca. In an instant, their gentle journey was turned into chaos. Odysseus awoke to the sound of whipping wind and crashing waves. He recognized the bag now empty at his feet and realized what his men had done. In desperation, he turned his ships back toward Aeolia, hoping for aid once more. They arrived before Aeolus and begged again for a wind to send them home. But this time the god was angry. He scowled at Odysseus. "You must be cursed," he said. "No mortal spared by the gods should be aided twice. It seems a divine curse is upon you." Aeolus refused to help further. With that, he sent Odysseus and his men away. Once more, the Cretan wind blew the ships out to sea, leaving the Greeks to fight the elements on their own. The gift of Aeolus had turned to misfortune, teaching the crew that fate cannot be tricked, and that mistrust and greed come at a terrible price. By now, the fleet was battered and bewildered, wandering the open sea. After many days, they spied a strange island. Weary and desperate, they hoped to find peace. This island turned out to be the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of enormous, savage giants who practiced human sacrifice. Odysseus anchored his own ship outside the bay and sent 3 scouts ashore with instructions to bring back news. The others waited anxiously aboard the remaining 11 ships. The scouts climbed a hill and saw a massive stone fortress set in sheer cliffs. In front of its gate stood a girl of incredible height named Antiphates, the daughter of the Laestrygonian king, also named Antiphates. She pointed the men toward her father's house. Hoping for help, the scouts went to the king's hall, but disaster struck instantly. The gigantic king, upon seeing them, snatched up one scout and devoured him whole. The other 2 fled in terror, racing back to the shoreline, shouting a warning. As they did, the Laestrygonians rose in anger. Hundreds of fierce giants swarmed down from the cliffs, each wielding massive rocks and spears with ease. The Laestrygonians assailed the 11 Greek ships anchored in the harbor. They pelted them with boulders, smashing their decks and masts. The sailors who tried to flee were speared as they swam. One by one, the 11 ships were destroyed. Only Odysseus's own ship, the one outside the bay, escaped the onslaught. Odysseus's heart sank with horror as he watched from the safety of his ship. Unable to help his men, he urged the few survivors aboard to row away. In moments, 11 ships and nearly all their crews were gone, lost to the brutal Laestrygonians. Only Odysseus's ship and a handful of his men remained. This was one of the most tragic episodes of Odysseus's journey. He lost a great number of loyal comrades, the friends who had fought by his side at Troy and endured so much with him. Standing alone on his deck among the empty sea, Odysseus felt the weight of his leadership. Many of his dearest men had perished before his eyes. The encounter with the Laestrygonians was a stark reminder that the world was full of merciless dangers, and that any stranger's land might hide monsters instead of refuge. The encounter with those people reminded the heroes that not all lands are populated by civilized men, and that any unknown shore can hide mortal danger. Odysseus, with a heavy heart, gazed at the empty spaces on the ship where his faithful comrades had once stood. Despair overtook the crew as they realized they would now have to continue their journey home almost alone. Keenly aware of how difficult and full of deadly threats this voyage could be. Having lost the greater part of his team, Odysseus and the few surviving companions pressed on. After several days, Odysseus's ship drew near to the mysterious and remote island of Aeaea, shrouded in dense woods and a mystical mist. The worn-out sailors, daunted by their losses, landed cautiously on the shore, not knowing what dangers this new land might hold. Aeaea was home to Circe, the famed sorceress and daughter of the sun god Helios and an Oceanid. Circe possessed immense magical power and could control the forces of nature and the minds of mortals. She lived alone in a splendid palace surrounded by thick gardens filled with exotic plants, magical herbs, and flowers. Despite her beauty and charms, Circe had a notorious reputation. Travelers who landed on her island rarely returned. With her witchcraft, she turned men into animals, especially pigs, symbolizing the hidden nature of their greed and debauchery. Odysseus did not rush straight to the palace. First, he split his crew into two groups. One he led himself, and the other his faithful friend Eurylochus led. It was Eurylochus's party that first went forward to scout, moving through the forest towards Circe's dwelling. As they approached the sorceress's home, the Greeks heard an enchanting song, accompanied by gentle music wafting through the woods. The weary wanderers were lured closer by the melody. Smitten by the song, the warriors could not resist its spell, and soon found themselves standing before Circe's magnificent house. Circe greeted the Greeks with extraordinary warmth and kindness, inviting them inside. She seated them at a beautifully set table and began serving the finest foods and sweet wine. Yet hidden within this feast was a potent enchantment. The food contained a powerful magical poison acting at once. When the men finished their meal, Circe raised her magic wand and, smiling, pronounced a spell. In an instant, the brave and proud heroes were transformed into squealing, helpless pigs, though they retained their human minds and awareness. The enchantress calmly herded them into a pigsty and began feeding them acorns, delighting in the humiliation of her new captives. Strangely enough, Eurylochus had not entered the house and thus escaped this fate. He returned in horror to Odysseus and told him what had happened. Driven by duty and responsibility for his men, Odysseus resolved to rescue them personally despite the protests and despair of the other sailors. He set off into the woods alone, full of anxiety but determined to restore his companions to their human forms. At this critical moment, Hermes, messenger of the gods, patron of travelers and clever heroes, came to Odysseus's aid. Hermes appeared before the hero disguised as a beautiful young man and gave him important instructions and secret counsel. The god warned him of Circe's magical powers and gave him a special herb called moly, a magical plant with a black root and snow-white blossoms, able to counter any enchantment of the sorceress. When Circe offers him a magical drink, he must discreetly eat this herb so that the spell will have no effect on him. But even after this, the hero must not let his guard down. He should draw his sword and threaten the witch with death. Only then will she recognize him as a worthy opponent and swear loyalty to him. Following Hermes' advice, Odysseus went to Circe's house and accepted her invitation. When she offered him the enchanted wine, he secretly consumed the herb and drank calmly. Seeing that her magic did not work, Circe was astonished and tried to intensify her spell, but in vain. Odysseus immediately drew his sword and resolutely threatened her with death if she did not free his comrades and cease her wicked deeds. The enchantress, confronting for the first time someone who had overcome her magic, was struck by the strength of his spirit and wisdom. Filled with respect, she surrendered and became his ally and lover. Odysseus stayed with Circe for a full year, enjoying her hospitality and love. Circe not only restored the human form of his companions, but also generously shared her knowledge and secrets of the magical arts with them. Their relationship was passionate and deep, filled with intimacy and mutual respect. Later sources even tell that from the union of Circe and Odysseus, a son named Telegonus was born. Telegonus, whose name in Greek means born far away, grew up under his mother's care and always dreamed of learning more about his father, of whom he had only heard legends. When Telegonus came of age, Circe told him the truth about his parentage, that his father was the famous King Odysseus of distant Ithaca. Filled with the desire to see his father and meet his family, the young man set sail for Ithaca. Circe also told Odysseus that the journey home would be impossible without a special prophecy, knowledge needed to understand the gods' plans and avoid new disasters. She advised Odysseus to undertake an extraordinary and dangerous voyage. He must descend into the realm of the dead, to the world of Hades. There he should find the famous seer Tiresias of Thebes, the legendary blind wise man who could see the future even in death. Tiresias was renowned for receiving his prophetic gift directly from the gods, and could explain the hidden designs of the divine powers. Only his prophecy could help Odysseus learn how to avoid further misfortunes and finally return home. This tale of descending to the underworld inspired many writers, including Dante in his Divine Comedy, James Joyce in his novel Ulysses, and it is reflected in the animation Spirited Away. Each of these works interprets the story differently, emphasizing its deep symbolism. After a long stay on Circe's island, Odysseus and his companions were compelled to set out again. This time their most unusual and terrifying trial awaited them, the journey to the kingdom of the dead. To the ancient Greeks, the underworld was a dismal and mournful place where the souls of the deceased wandered without purpose or rest. To enter it and meet Tiresias, Odysseus had to perform a special ritual on a distant shore at the entrance to the afterlife. The hero and his men arrived at the appointed place and performed the sacrifices Circe had told them to do. They dug a deep pit and filled it with the blood of their sacrificial animals to attract the souls of the dead. When the shades of the departed began to rise from the darkness, Odysseus felt horror and awe. He was standing at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Among the many bodiless shadows, Odysseus finally noticed the spirit of Tiresias, the famous blind prophet of Thebes. Tiresias drank the blood from the pit, and his phantom gained a voice. The seer told Odysseus that the gods were angry with him, and that the road home would be long and difficult, full of trials and new losses. He gave the hero precise and invaluable advice. The journey could only end well if Odysseus and his crew did not harm the sacred cattle of the sun, god Helios on the island of Thrinacia. If this command were broken, all of Odysseus's companions would die, and Odysseus himself would return home alone, having lost ship and crew. Moreover, Tiresias revealed that even after returning to Ithaca, Odysseus would not immediately find peace. He would be forced to undertake one more journey, carrying an oar on his shoulder to travel to lands where people had never seen the sea. Only after making a sacrifice to Poseidon, there would he be granted the long-awaited peace and a quiet old age. Receiving these prophecies, Odysseus felt both relief and fear for the future. But his stay in the underworld did not end there. Turning around, he saw familiar shades of dead heroes and loved ones gathering around the pit, coming to drink blood and speak with the living man. One of the most moving encounters was Odysseus's meeting with the spirit of his own mother, Anticlea. She had died from longing for her son during his absence. Anticlea spoke to him about how hard life had become for his wife, Penelope, forced to fend off the suitors, and how their son Telemachus had grown. Anticlea tried to embrace her son, but her formless shade dissolved in his arms, causing Odysseus deep sorrow. Equally unforgettable was his meeting with the greatest heroes of the Trojan War, Achilles and Agamemnon. Achilles, the mightiest of warriors who had fallen outside the walls of Troy, candidly told Odysseus that he would rather be the lowest slave among the living than a king among the dead, emphasizing the tragic nature of his fate and the emptiness of glory after death. This encounter was a profound lesson for Odysseus about the value of life and the importance of returning home alive and unharmed. Agamemnon recounted his own tragic murder at the hands of his wife and her lover immediately after he returned from Troy. and warned Odysseus to be cautious when he returned home and not to trust even close friends too easily so as not to repeat his bitter fate. Odysseus also met other heroes, the mighty Ajax, Hercules, and even King Minos, who judged the dead. All of this had a heavy and lasting impact on the hero, causing him to reevaluate his own actions, mistakes, and the importance of the trials that still lay ahead on his journey home. The journey to the underworld is one of the most important and symbolic episodes of the entire Odyssey. It shows not only the inner strength and courage of the hero, willing to go to the extreme, but also allows a glimpse into the depths of the human soul, reflecting on the value of life, glory, and home. Leaving the realm of the dead, Odysseus was deeply shaken, but at the same time armed with priceless knowledge and guidance. Tiresias's prophecy and the meetings with the dead heroes became for him a source of wisdom, understanding, and the strength necessary to continue his long and arduous journey home. After the harrowing journey to the underworld, Odysseus and his companions returned once more to Circe's island to prepare for further sailing. The sorceress, learning that her guest had met Tiresias and received the prophecy, gave him new important instructions. She warned him about the deadly dangers that lay ahead, especially the imminent encounter with the sirens. Sirens were mysterious creatures whose enchanted song inevitably led sailors to their doom. According to ancient Greek mythology, these half-women, half-birds lived on a small island, surrounded by treacherous, sharp reefs. They possessed voices so enchanting that anyone who heard their singing became utterly spellbound. Legend said that the sirens were once beautiful maidens, but for their arrogance and vanity they were transformed by the gods into their half-woman, half-bird forms, doomed forever to lure sailors with their deadly song. Anyone who heard a siren's voice instantly forgot everything else in the world. Their songs were full of promises, beckoning visions and sweet memories of home, family, glory, and happiness. The hypnotic power of their voices was so great that sailors unerringly steered their ships onto the rocks, smashing their vessels and drowning in the sea. Meanwhile, the sirens reveled in the destruction, taking the souls of the dead and leaving their bodies to the waves and wind. Circe gave Odysseus detailed advice on how to avoid this fate and not fall victim to this fatal temptation. She told him to stop the ears of all the crew with wax so that none of them could hear the deadly song. However, Odysseus, driven by insatiable curiosity and the desire to learn the unknown, decided to do the opposite. He ordered his sailors to bind him tightly to the mast of the ship and to obey his commands no matter what pleas or demands he might make. He himself intended to hear the siren's song and still survive, a feat no mortal had ever accomplished before. When the ship approached the siren's island, the sea suddenly fell completely calm. The air was filled with a strange silence, as if all living things had held their breath. Soon this silence was broken by the siren's enchanting song, sweet and unspeakably beautiful, which enveloped everything around. Odysseus immediately felt its powerful effect. His mind became clouded, and his heart filled with a torturous longing. He desperately begged his companions to untie him and steer the ship toward the island. But the wise and loyal men, following their captain's instructions, only tightened his bonds further and continued rowing, paying no heed to his pleas and commands. Odysseus himself writhed in frustration, trying to break free and reach the mysterious singers. So strong was the power of their enchantment. The siren's song promised Odysseus the secrets of the universe, knowledge of all past and future, and the hero was, for a moment, willing to give everything just to touch those mysteries. But his steadfast sailors, with their ears blocked with wax and immune to the deadly melody, rowed on unceasingly. When the ship safely passed the Sirens' Island and moved far enough that their voices finally faded away, the crew carefully removed the wax from their ears and freed Odysseus from his bonds. Exhausted but alive, he could only recall with a mix of fear and relief how close he had come to death. He had become the first person to ever hear the siren's song and survive, an achievement in itself that required incredible endurance and cunning. Having safely navigated past the deadly sirens and their spellbinding song, Odysseus and his companions pressed on. But awaiting them next was an even more terrifying trial, one of the most cunning and perilous of all. The strait where the monsters Scylla and Charybdis lived, a stretch of sea between two deadly hazards. Circe had warned Odysseus in advance about this danger, explaining that the channel they had to pass through was so narrow that it was impossible to avoid encountering at least one of these monsters. On one side of the strait, high in a dark and gloomy cave, lived Scylla. This terrible creature had 6 long necks, each ending in a head bristling with 3 rows of dagger-like teeth. From afar, Scylla looked like an enormous, misshapen serpent. According to ancient myth, Scylla was once a beautiful nymph, the daughter of the sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. It was said that the sea god Glaucus once fell madly in love with Scylla, but she did not return his affection. Glaucus sought help from the sorceress Circe, but Circe herself, also in love with Glaucus, became consumed with jealousy and hatred toward Scylla. Driven by her envy, Circe laced the waters where Scylla bathed with magical herbs, turning her into a monster. Ever since, Scylla had become incredibly swift and fierce. From her lair in the high rocks, she could strike passing ships in an instant, seizing sailors from the decks and devouring them alive. On the opposite shore of the channel lay Charybdis, an enormous sea whirlpool capable in an instant of swallowing an entire ship with all its crew, leaving no trace. According to myth, Charybdis was once a nymph who had dared to challenge Zeus himself, and was punished by being transformed into a monstrous whirlpool, which 3 times a day sucked in huge volumes of water and then spit them back out. Before Odysseus now lay a dreadful choice. He understood that avoiding death was impossible. He could only decide how great the sacrifice would be. Circe had given him bitter but wise advice. Steer closer to Scylla in order to lose only 6 of his men, 1 for each of her heads, but save the ship and the rest of the crew. If he risked coming too close to Charybdis, he would inevitably lose everything at once. Ship and men would all be swallowed in an instant. When the ship approached the strait, all the sailors were filled with terror. They saw the water ahead roiling and foaming, heard the thunderous roar and the groaning of the current. Odysseus, however, did not tell his crew the full truth of the ordeal awaiting them, fearing that men seized by panic would refuse to obey and fall into chaos. He merely took the helm and ordered the crew to row with all their might toward the rocky side where Scylla lurked. Suddenly, in the most critical moment when all eyes were fixed on the churning whirlpool of Charybdis, a terrifying shriek echoed from the black cave. Long serpentine necks, each ending in a venomous head with hate-filled eyes, shot out of the darkness. In one instant, Scylla seized 6 of the sailors, men who screamed in horror, helplessly struggling to break free from her dreadful grasp. The rest of the crew, struck with grief and fear, continued to row on, fighting through the agony of losing their comrades. Odysseus later confessed that he saw nothing more horrifying than the death of his loyal men, who were calling out his name in their final moments, and whom he was powerless to save. He had been forced to make this terrible sacrifice in order to save the rest of the crew. But it was exactly this heart-wrenching decision that allowed him to preserve the lives of the majority of his remaining men and successfully pass through the strait, leaving that fearful place behind. Odysseus and his companions, devastated by grief and terror, continued their journey home. They realized that their trials were far from over, and that their will and endurance would be tested by new, equally severe challenges in the days ahead. Odysseus and his crew pressed on, understanding that ahead of them lay the island of Thrinacia, the domain of the sun god Helios. During his journey into the underworld, Odysseus had received a stern warning from the prophet Tiresias never to harm the sacred cattle and oxen of Helios grazing there. Circe had reinforced this warning, emphasizing that violating this command would bring disaster. When Odysseus approached the island, he reminded his companions of this strict divine ban and urged them not to touch the sacred animals. The crew, exhausted by endless wandering, loss, and suffering, promised to follow his commands. The heroes landed on the island only to gather fresh water and rest, intending to set sail again as soon as possible. But the gods decided to test the endurance of Odysseus's men once more. Soon after their arrival, a terrible storm broke out that prevented the sailors from leaving. Day after day, the winds did not calm. The sky was filled with dark clouds, and the sea raged so fiercely that the ship could not depart from the island. The provisions began to run out, and the crew grew weak and famished. Driven by hunger and despair, the men started to lose hope and reason. The situation became especially dire after Odysseus went inland alone to pray to the gods and seek their help. At that time, Eurylochus, Odysseus's closest friend and one of the most respected officers, could not bear the trial of hunger any longer. He began to urge his comrades to defy the gods' command. In a passionate speech, he argued that it would be better to die by angering the gods than to perish a dishonorable death from starvation. Eurylochus convinced the sailors that once they returned home, they would atone by offering sacrifices to the gods and beg for forgiveness, thereby hoping to avert divine punishment. Weakness and despair took hold of the crew, and the men succumbed to temptation. They slaughtered some of Helios's sacred cattle and began to prepare them for food, blatantly violating the gods' express command. At that fateful moment, Odysseus returned and was horrified at what he saw. He understood that by this act his companions had sealed their own fate. The doom of the entire crew was now decided. Helios, finding out about this terrible sacrilege, was furious. He went to Zeus in anger, demanding that the mortals be punished for their audacity and blasphemy. He threatened that if justice were not served, he would abandon the sky forever, taking the light and warmth from the world. Zeus was forced to agree, and the destiny of Odysseus's men was sealed. When the storm finally subsided, the heroes hurried to board their ship and flee, hoping to escape the gods' wrath. But as soon as the island disappeared from view, the skies darkened once more, and a thunderous bolt of lightning shot by Zeus struck Odysseus's ship, shattering it in an instant. All the crew perished, save Odysseus himself. The hero alone miraculously survived. For 9 days and 9 nights he drifted alone in the waves, clinging to the wreckage of his ship, until at last he was washed ashore on the coast of the island of the nymph Calypso. Odysseus now found himself entirely alone. All his friends and companions were gone, and he would have to continue his journey home by himself, bearing the heavy weight of knowing that it was his men's mistakes and his own inability to prevent them. that had led to such a dreadful outcome. For 9 days and nights he clung to the wreckage of his shattered ship, battling the cold, hunger, and despair, until finally the waves cast him upon the shore of a mysterious and distant island called Ogygia. This island was beautiful and isolated, its beaches lined with lush gardens and groves, filled with sweet fragrances and the songs of birds. It was here that the immortal nymph Calypso lived, daughter of the Titan Atlas, renowned for her unsurpassed beauty and magical power. Calypso was extraordinarily fair and enigmatic, and she possessed the power to hold mortals on her island, offering them eternal youth and immortality. Seeing Odysseus feeble, barely alive, and worn out from his long wanderings, Calypso took pity on him. She decided to save the hero from certain death. The nymph tended to Odysseus with great care and attention. She healed his wounds and restored his strength, giving him food and drink. Over time, Calypso fell in love with Odysseus and offered him eternal life and youth on her island, promising that he would forever forget all his past sufferings and be happy. However, what seemed a wonderful gift turned into a cruel trial for the hero. Odysseus could not accept Calypso's offer, despite her beauty and the promise of everlasting happiness. His heart and soul were consumed by longing for home, for his native Ithaca, his beloved wife Penelope, and his son, whom he had hardly seen. For him, immortality and eternal youth were worth nothing if he could not return to his home and live out a normal human life. Calypso sincerely loved the hero, but she could not bring herself to let him go. Her love and desire to keep Odysseus on the island overpowered her compassion. Thus began Odysseus's imprisonment on Calypso's island, a captivity that lasted a grueling 7 years. Each day Odysseus sat on the shore staring out at the endless horizon, dreaming of the sails of a ship that would finally free him from unbearable loneliness and sorrow. Each night he fell asleep tormented by memories of home and a sense of helplessness before the fate that had taken his friends, his home, and his freedom. Calypso spent each night with Odysseus, sharing her bed and trying to alleviate his homesickness. There was intimacy between them, filled with tenderness, passion, and care. Yet even as he enjoyed her beauty and attention, he could not forget his homeland, Penelope, and his son. In body he belonged to Calypso, but in heart and mind he was still far away. Trapped on the island, Odysseus found himself in a paradoxical state, surrounded by beauty and comfort, yet deeply unhappy, unable to make his own decisions and control his destiny. No trial, not even the encounter with the sirens or the battle with the Cyclops, was as agonizing and unbearable as this long, seemingly endless captivity with Calypso. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, the gods watched over Odysseus's fate. Athena, goddess of wisdom and his chief protector, repeatedly begged Zeus for mercy and justice. Finally, Zeus took pity and sent his messenger Hermes with a command to Calypso. The nymph was ordered to let Odysseus go and allow him to return home. When Calypso heard the command of the gods, she was deeply hurt and upset. She bitterly accused the gods of envy, reminding them that immortal gods themselves often married mortal women. She considered it unfair that she was not permitted to live with a mortal man. Nevertheless, despite her reluctance, Calypso was forced to obey Zeus's will. She helped Odysseus build a sturdy raft, provided him with necessary supplies and provisions, and gave detailed instructions on how to sail back to Ithaca. As they parted, she wept and confessed to Odysseus that she truly loved him and only wanted his happiness. She said she released him only because the gods demanded it, not by her own choice. Odysseus left the island with joy and relief, and with deep gratitude toward the nymph who had saved his life and treated him with love, even if it was not returned. But now his final trial loomed ahead, the journey back to his native Ithaca and the reunion with those he loved, and for whom he had been willing to endure all these hardships. Odysseus set out on his raft, and soon the open sea engulfed him. However, Poseidon, still nursing a grudge for the blinding of his son Polyphemus, decided to give the hero one last test. The sea god unleashed a terrible storm, raising huge waves and trying to hurl Odysseus back into the depths. The hero was close to death again, but the gods did not leave him without aid. The sea goddess Ino, Leucothea, took pity on Odysseus as he struggled in the waves. She gave him a magical veil or shawl that helped him stay afloat, allowing him to survive in the raging sea. After 2 days of battling the storm and waves, completely exhausted, Odysseus finally reached the shores of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians were renowned for their love of the sea, their hospitality, and their nobility. Their king was the wise and kindly Alcinous. On the shore of this island, Odysseus, his last sanctuary lost and protection gone, collapsed in utter exhaustion amid the coastal thickets. In the morning, the young princess Nausicaa, daughter of Alcinous, went down to the shore with her handmaidens to wash linen. It was she who stumbled upon the sleeping hero. At first, Odysseus's appearance frightened the girls. He was unkempt, wasted, and nearly naked. However, his noble demeanor and the way he spoke, even in this pitiable state, won them over. Nausicaa took pity on him. She gave Odysseus clothes and food, and pointed him to the palace of her father and mother. She also advised him on how to behave upon meeting the king and queen, urging discretion and respect. Entering King Alcinous's luxurious palace, Odysseus fell to his knees before the king and his wife Arete, begging for help. He did not immediately reveal his name or identity, following the old wisdom of being cautious and not trusting strangers completely. Nevertheless, he humbly asked for the chance to return home. Alcinous, moved by the sight of the weary stranger and impressed by his noble manners, immediately showed great generosity and promised to help. The next day, the king held a magnificent feast in honor of the guest. All the nobles of the Phaeacians were invited. During the festivities, the famous bard Demodocus sang songs of the Trojan War. Hearing these tales, Odysseus was deeply moved. Memories of the past and the horrors he had endured overcame him and brought him to tears. Noticing this reaction, Alcinous discreetly asked the guest to reveal his name and explain why the story had touched him so deeply. It was then that Odysseus, for the first time in all his years of wandering, told the Phaeacians his true story. Odysseus's account, which later became the core of Homer's Odyssey, was artfully and movingly structured. He began with the end of the Trojan War and gradually recounted all the horrors and tragedies he had experienced over the years. The Phaeacians listened breathlessly, filled with genuine sympathy and admiration for the hero's endurance and wisdom. King Alcinous, deeply touched by what he heard, assured Odysseus that his people would at once help him return to his native Ithaca. The king promised to send the hero home on the fastest Phaeacian ships, which were known for their incredible swiftness and ability, under the favor of the gods, to reach any shore easily. This episode marked a turning point in the tale. Here, for the first time, Odysseus found true understanding and help, and he sensed the closeness of his long-awaited homecoming. The Phaeacians' actions underscored the important Greek value of hospitality and showed that compassion and kindness could be found even among strangers willing to aid a stranded wayfarer. True to his word, King Alcinous prepared the fastest ship and helped Odysseus embark on the journey home. The voyage was smooth and swift under divine protection. The hero, exhausted by his long wanderings, fell into a deep sleep during the crossing. When he awoke, he was already on the shores of his homeland, Ithaca. However, the assistance of the Phaeacians did not go unnoticed by Poseidon. The sea god was angered that his will had once again been thwarted. Having obtained Zeus's permission to punish the Phaeacians, Poseidon transformed the ship that had brought Odysseus safely home into stone upon the shores of Scheria. This terrible punishment was meant as a warning to the Phaeacians. Never again defy the gods' will by aiding mortals. King Alcinous saw what had happened and recognized the gods' wrath. He admonished his people to be more cautious in helping strangers in the future, lest they bring even greater wrath upon themselves. Now Odysseus stood on the shore of his native Ithaca, but he did not immediately recognize the land he had dreamed of for so many years. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and his protector, had cloaked the island in mist to give Odysseus time to comprehend his situation and prepare for what was to come. After his long ordeal, he found himself finally where every minute of his journey had brought him in hope. Yet in that moment, the hero felt only anxiety and caution. Too much might have changed during his 20-year absence. The first being to greet Odysseus on Ithaca was Athena herself. She appeared to him in the form of a young shepherd and struck up a conversation. Odysseus, as was his nature, remained cautious and wise, not immediately revealing his true name or origins. Athena was pleased by his restraint and then revealed her true identity to him. She dispelled the veil of mist and told him that his home was in danger. Penelope, his wife, was beset by arrogant suitors who were trying by force to marry her and seize his kingdom. And their son Telemachus had been striving for years to hold them off, but was still too young to set matters right alone. Athena helped Odysseus by changing his appearance, making him look like an old beggar. She advised him to go first to his faithful swineherd, Eumaeus. Despite all the long years of his master's absence, Eumaeus had remained completely loyal. He continued to care for Odysseus's pigs, always hoping and waiting for the return of his lord. The meeting with Eumaeus was deeply touching for Odysseus. In that moment, he realized that not all was lost, that he was still remembered and loved, and that loyalty still existed in the world. However, Odysseus did not reveal his identity to Eumaeus at once. Instead, he chose to test the swineherd's loyalty and caution first. Meanwhile, Athena went in search of Telemachus, who at that time was traveling in distant lands seeking news of his missing father. The goddess advised the young man to return home quickly, warning that the time for decisive action was near. When Telemachus arrived in Ithaca, he headed straight to find Eumaeus. The most poignant moment in Odysseus's long wanderings then unfolded, the meeting of father and son. At first, Telemachus did not recognize Odysseus, seeing only a ragged stranger. Then Athena lifted her temporary enchantment, restoring Odysseus's true form. Telemachus was astonished and rushed into his father's arms. This reunion was filled with tears of sorrow and joy at once, and with the realization that together they could restore justice and protect their home from the insolent suitors. Together, Odysseus and Telemachus devised a plan to ensure the suitors would have no chance of resistance. Telemachus secretly had all the weapons carried out of the great hall of the palace, where the suitors usually feasted, and hidden away, leaving only the arms for himself and his father. This way, the heroes ensured they had a crucial advantage for the coming fight. Returning to the palace in his beggar's guise, Odysseus witnessed the suitors' outrageous behavior. They had been squandering his wealth, insulting Penelope and the household, and defiling the sacred customs of hospitality. Each day, Penelope remained faithful in her own way. She had told the suitors that she would choose a husband once she finished weaving a funeral shroud for her father-in-law, old King Laertes. Each night, however, she secretly unraveled the work she had done by day, thus delaying the inevitable. When the suitors eventually learned of this cunning, she was forced to resort to a desperate measure. Penelope announced one final contest, an archery challenge using Odysseus's own bow, the weapon that only he could handle. She declared that she would marry the man who could string the mighty bow and shoot an arrow through the holes of 12 axes set up in a row. One by one, the suitors tried and failed to string Odysseus's great bow. None of them could exert the strength to bend the powerful weapon. Then Odysseus, yet still disguised as a beggar, asked permission to try the challenge. The suitors met this with scorn and laughter, mocking and insulting him. But Telemachus insisted that his father be allowed to attempt the feat. Odysseus easily strung the bow to the astonishment and horror of everyone present, and without error sent an arrow straight through all 12 axe heads. A chilling silence fell over the hall. In that instant, the beggar flung off his disguise, revealing his true identity. The climactic moment of the epic saga had arrived, the moment of revenge. Odysseus and his few loyal servants drew their weapons and sprang into battle against the crazed suitors. The suitors, realizing too late, scrambled to grab weapons of their own, only to find that Telemachus had hidden them elsewhere. Panic seized their hearts as they understood they were trapped. The fight that followed was fierce and merciless. The suitors had committed the gravest crimes of all. They had violated the laws of hospitality and honor, turned their backs on the gods, and insulted the very house of its master. Thanks to Odysseus's wisdom and battle experience, he overcame them completely. Every last one of the suitors was defeated, and justice was restored to the kingdom. After the slaughter, Odysseus remembered the servants who had betrayed Penelope and secretly consorted with the suitors, enabling their brazen behavior and betraying the household. He ordered that they be punished severely. With Telemachus and Eumaeus, he gathered up these disloyal maids and had them hanged in the courtyard of the palace. This harsh but just punishment was the final act of cleansing Odysseus's home of shame and betrayal. Penelope, however, still doubted and feared to believe that her husband had truly returned. She devised one last test for Odysseus. She told him that their marriage bed could be moved if her husband commanded it. Something only Odysseus himself, who had built the bed from an olive tree rooted in the ground, would know was impossible. When Odysseus described the bed's secret details, Penelope at last recognized her husband. She fell into his arms, overcome with emotion. After so many years of trials and suffering, the spouses were finally reunited once more. After Odysseus had dealt with the suitors and the traitorous servants, it seemed that peace and justice had finally returned to long-suffering Ithaca. However, the bloodshed could not pass unnoticed among the island's people. News of the massacre spread quickly, and the inhabitants of Ithaca were deeply divided. Many common folk rejoiced sincerely at the return of their rightful king, knowing that justice had been long overdue. These people remembered Odysseus's name and lamented their suffering during his long absence. They welcomed the restoration of the rightful order. But the relatives and friends of the slain suitors were consumed by anger and grief. They accused Odysseus of excessive cruelty and of acting as judge, jury, and executioner without proper authority. The deaths of the suitors, many of whom belonged to noble and influential families, threatened to spark open conflict. There was a real danger of a new civil war. In this tense situation, the wise Odysseus realized he could not act alone to settle the disputes. Once again, Athena came to the hero's aid. Disguised as an old mentor, she appeared among the Ithacans who were gathered in fury. The goddess spoke reason to the crowd, convincing them that Odysseus's actions had been just and warranted. She reminded everyone that the suitors themselves were to blame for the tragedy. They had grossly violated the laws of hospitality, offended gods, and brought ruin upon themselves through their wrongdoing. Athena's words were persuasive. Gradually, the hostility and thirst for vengeance among the people began to ease. The Ithacans realized that continuing the conflict would only lead to more suffering, and they reluctantly accepted Odysseus's return as the restoration of rightful order in the kingdom. Thanks to the patience and wisdom of their king and the divine influence of Athena, trust and goodwill were finally restored between Odysseus and the citizens of Ithaca. Odysseus then took an important step to solidify this peace. He departed the palace and sought out his aged father, old Laertes, who had been living alone in despair, believing his son lost forever. The reunion of father and son was another deeply moving episode that helped Odysseus feel truly at home again. With Laertes and his son Telemachus united, Odysseus gained the support of many influential families of Ithaca. Their backing helped demonstrate that the royal family was once more united and in control. Meanwhile, the relatives of the slain suitors had assembled, ready to attack the palace in revenge. Only thanks to Athena's timely intervention, as she appeared in the form of an old mentor standing between the warring parties, was another bloody battle averted. The goddess persuaded the Ithacans to stand down, recognizing that the suitors themselves were to blame for dishonoring the customs and provoking the gods. After Athena's wise words, the enmity gradually dissipated. The people understood that further conflict would only bring new calamity, and they slowly accepted Odysseus's return as a rightful restoration of order. The grudges faded, and Ithaca returned to a fragile peace. The final important moment was the establishment of a solemn agreement to forgive past wrongs. Athena herself called upon the Ithacans and Odysseus's family to swear an oath before the gods of reconciliation, forgiveness, and forgetting the past offenses. All parties agreed, recognizing that this was the only way for peace and prosperity to be fully restored to the island. With this, Odysseus' story in the Odyssey comes to its conclusion, a tale of trials and triumphs. The king of Ithaca had finally returned, regained his home, and been reunited with his loved ones. However, in ancient myth, the story of Ithaca did not completely end with the Odyssey. There exists another ancient epic called the Telegony, which tells the continuation and tragic ending of Odysseus's life. The Telegony was a poem from around the 6th century BCEE, traditionally attributed to Eugamon of Cyrene. The complete text of the Telegony has not survived. We know its contents only from later summaries and brief mentions in other ancient works. Despite being lost, the story it told was well known in antiquity and seen as a kind of mythological sequel to the adventures of Odysseus, extending to the fate of his family and descendants. As mentioned, Odysseus had a son by Circe, named Telegonus, which means born far away. Telegonus grew up on Aea and longed to see his father. When he came of age, Circe revealed to him that his father was none other than King Odysseus of Ithaca. Fired with the desire to meet his father and learn about the man of whom he had heard only tales, Telegonus set sail for Ithaca. Circe even provided him with an unusual weapon, a spear tipped with a barb from a venomous stingray, so that he could have a powerful weapon to protect himself on his journey. After a long and difficult voyage, Telegonus finally arrived at the shores of Ithaca. However, in the twilight, he did not recognize the place. To him, it seemed like a foreign land. Without realizing whose homeland it was, he began to raid the local cattle. The people of Ithaca, thinking he was a hostile stranger, went to report the attack to King Odysseus. Odysseus, defending the islanders, confronted this unknown warrior. Neither man recognized the other. They fought bravely, each believing the other to be a foe. In the duel that ensued, Telegonus struck Odysseus with his spear. The shaft was smeared with the deadly poison of the stingray barb. Odysseus collapsed, mortally wounded. When the battle ended and the mortally wounded Odysseus fell to the ground, father and son finally recognized each other in horror. Telegonus realized with profound terror and despair what he had done. He had fatally wounded his own father. There was nothing to be done. The poison took effect, and Odysseus died in his son's arms, at last giving his weary spirit rest. Grief-stricken and anguished by what had happened, Telegonus collected the body of his father. He then returned to Circe's island with Penelope and Telemachus. There, Circe performed the solemn funeral rites for Odysseus. Afterward, according to one tradition, Circe married Telemachus, taking him as her husband, and Telegonus married Penelope, thus forming a strange new family order. On Ithaca, in the home that had belonged to Odysseus, Telegonus and Penelope became parents to a son named Italus. According to legend, this child Italus became the ancestor of the tribes that later inhabited the land known as Italy, and it is said that he gave his name to that land, Italia. In this way, the descendants of great King Odysseus became the progenitors of new peoples and lands beyond Greece. The myth of Telegonus, despite its tragic and unusual events, was an important way in ancient times to explain connections between the Greeks and other peoples of the Mediterranean. It served as a lesson on the cruelty of fate and the inevitability of destiny. Even when it seems absurd or cruel, one cannot escape what is predestined. The ending of Odysseus' story is thus tragic, underscoring how complex and unpredictable human destinies can be. Yet it is precisely this richness and drama that made the myths of Odysseus and his descendants among the most memorable and influential in world culture. On this note, our tale ends.